In the frozen wastes of the Arctic, where the ice stretches endlessly beneath skies of perpetual twilight, where the cold penetrates to the very marrow of one's bones, and the silence is broken only by the groaning of ice floes and the howling of distant winds. In that desolate realm, at the uttermost edge of the world, a ship found itself trapped, held fast in the grip of the polar ice, while its crew waited with growing desperation for the thaw that would either free them or doom them to a frozen grave. Captain Robert Walton, commander of that ill-fated vessel, had come to these inhospitable waters in pursuit of glory and discovery, driven by the same ambition that has always propelled explorers into the unknown regions of the world. He dreamed of finding a passage through the polar seas, of planting his flag where no man had stood before, of returning to England wreathed in the laurels of achievement. But instead, he found himself becalmed in the ice, and there, in that place of desolation, he encountered a man who would tell him a tale so extraordinary, so terrible, so filled with warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition, that it would haunt Walton for the remainder of his days. The man arrived on a sled of ice, pulled by dogs, pursuing some creature that had fled across the frozen waste. He was near death from exposure and exhaustion, his body wasted by hardship, and his eyes burning with a fever that seemed to consume him from within. The sailors brought him aboard, wrapped him in blankets, gave him warm broth, and waited to see if he would survive the night. He did survive, though barely. And as he slowly recovered his strength, he began to speak, to tell Captain Walton the story of his life, a narrative of such profound tragedy and terrible warning that the captain felt compelled to record every word. His name was Victor Frankenstein, and he had once been a man of promise and position, a student of natural philosophy who had pushed the boundaries of science beyond all moral and natural limits, and who now suffered the consequences of his unholy ambition. This is his tale, preserved in Walton's letters to his sister in England, a chronicle of genius and madness, of creation and destruction, of a man who sought to be as God and became instead the architect of his own damnation. Victor Frankenstein was born in Geneva to a family of distinction and wealth. His childhood was one of privilege and affection, spent in the company of his beloved parents, his adopted sister Elizabeth, beautiful and gentle, who would become his intended bride, and his dear friend Henri Clerval, whose poetic soul and love of romance provided a perfect counterpoint to Victor's scientific temperament. It was an idyllic youth, filled with all the advantages that wealth and loving parents could provide, and nothing in those early years suggested the darkness that would eventually consume him. But, even as a child, Victor possessed a curiosity that went beyond the normal bounds of inquiry. While other boys played at soldiers or explored the countryside, Victor immersed himself in books of ancient learning, the works of Cornelius Agrippa, Paracelsus, and Albertus Magnus, those alchemists and natural philosophers who had sought the elixir of life and the philosopher's stone. His father dismissed these pursuits as waste of time, telling Victor that such outdated theories had been superseded by modern science, but Victor felt drawn to them nonetheless, fascinated by the grand ambitions they represented, by the possibility of mastering nature itself and bending it to human will. A turning point came during a thunderstorm when Victor witnessed lightning strike and utterly destroy an old oak tree near his home. The violence and power of that electrical discharge, the complete annihilation of the ancient tree in a single instant, demonstrated to Victor the tremendous forces that coursed through nature. A man of science who happened to be visiting explained to Victor the modern theories of electricity and galvanism, and in that moment Victor's path was determined. He would devote himself to understanding the fundamental forces of life and nature, would master the secrets that had eluded all previous philosophers. When Victor reached the appropriate age, he departed for the University of Ingolstadt to pursue his studies. But before he could leave, tragedy struck. His mother contracted scarlet fever while nursing Elizabeth through the illness and died. Her last words, a plea that Victor and Elizabeth should someday marry. This first encounter with death profoundly affected Victor, making him more determined than ever to unlock the secrets of life itself, to conquer mortality and banish death from the world. At Ingolstadt, Victor fell under the influence of two professors who would shape his destiny. Professor Krempe, who taught natural philosophy, was dismissive of Victor's interest in the ancient alchemists and urged him to forget such nonsense and focus on legitimate modern science. But Professor Waldman, who taught chemistry, took a different approach. He acknowledged that while the old alchemists had been wrong in their methods, their ambitions had been noble, and modern science had the tools to achieve what they had only dreamed of. The ancient teachers of this science, Waldman told Victor, promised impossibilities and performed nothing. The modern masters promise very little. They know that metals cannot be transmuted and that the elixir of life is a chimera. But these philosophers, whose hands seem only made to dabble in dirt, and their eyes to pore over the microscope or crucible, have indeed performed miracles. They penetrate into the recesses of nature and show how she works in her hiding places. These words ignited something in Victor's soul. He threw himself into his studies with obsessive intensity, mastering chemistry, anatomy, and physiology with preternatural speed. He studied the processes of decay and corruption, spent countless hours in charnel houses and graveyards, examining the stages of decomposition, sought to understand the precise moment when life departed from the body and death took hold. And gradually, through observations and experiments that he would later refuse to describe in detail, he claimed to have discovered the secret, the principle of life itself, the spark that animated dead matter and transformed it into living flesh. The discovery should have filled him with joy and satisfaction, should have been shared with the scientific community for the benefit of all mankind. But Victor, in his arrogance and his ambition, decided to keep the secret to himself, to be the sole possessor of this godlike knowledge. And more than that, he decided to demonstrate his discovery in the most dramatic way possible. He would create life, would build a human being from component parts, and bestow upon it the gift of animation. For months, Victor labored in solitude, shunning the company of friends and family, working through the nights in his apartment, which he had transformed into a workshop of horrors. He collected materials from slaughterhouses and dissecting rooms, assembled bones and organs and tissues with meticulous care, constructing a figure of gigantic stature, for he found that the minuteness of the parts slowed his progress impossibly, and so he decided to create a being some 8 feet in height, with proportions to match. It was on a dreary night in November that Victor finally completed his work. The rain pattered dismally against the window panes as he made his final preparations, checking and rechecking every connection, every component of his creation. The figure lay on the table before him, a thing of immense size, its features carefully selected to be beautiful, its limbs proportioned with mathematical precision. Victor had intended to create something magnificent, a new species that would bless him as its creator, that would look upon him with gratitude and love. But when he finally applied the galvanic current, when the spark of life coursed through the assembled tissues, and the creature's dull yellow eye opened to stare at him, in that moment of supreme triumph, Victor felt only horror and revulsion. The being he had created was hideous beyond description. Its skin was translucent, showing the muscles and arteries beneath. Its hair was lustrous black and flowing, its teeth pearly white. But these formed only a more horrid contrast with the watery eyes, the shriveled complexion, the straight black lips. The creature's very appearance was an affront to nature, and Victor, who had worked so long and so hard to give it life, could not bear to look upon what he had made. He fled from his apartment in disgust and horror, wandering the streets of Ingolstadt in a state of nervous collapse. The creature, abandoned by its creator in the first moments of its existence, disappeared into the night. Victor convinced himself that it must have perished, unable to survive without his care and guidance. He fell ill with a brain fever that lasted for months, nursed through his delirium by his faithful friend Henry Clerval, who had come to join him at the university. But the creature had not perished. It had survived, and in the months that followed, it had learned to find food and shelter, learned to speak by observing a family of cottagers, learned to read from books it discovered, learned about human society and its place, or rather, its lack of place within it. The creature was intelligent, possessed of feelings and desires and aspirations, but its hideous appearance ensured that it would be rejected and feared by every human who encountered it. The creature tried to win the affection of the cottagers it had been observing, believing that if it could only make them understand its benevolent nature, they would overlook its appearance and accept it as a friend. But when it finally revealed itself, they reacted with terror and violence, driving it away with blows and curses. This rejection, after months of patient observation and growing affection, broke something in the creature's soul. It began to understand that it would never be accepted, never be loved, never find a place in human society. And so the creature's love turned to hatred. Its desire for companionship transformed into a burning need for revenge against the Creator who had brought it into existence, only to abandon it to a life of loneliness and suffering. Victor, meanwhile, had recovered from his illness and returned to Geneva, eager to see his family after his long absence and to marry Elizabeth, as his mother had wished. But his homecoming was marred by terrible news. His youngest brother, William, had been murdered, strangled by unknown hands while playing in the woods near the family estate. Victor's father was devastated, Elizabeth racked with guilt, for William had been wearing a miniature portrait of their mother at the time of his death, and it had been taken from his body. Justine Moritz a young woman who had been taken in by the Frankenstein family and who loved William dearly, was accused of the murder when the miniature was found in her possession. She was tried, convicted, and executed, despite Victor's private certainty of her innocence. For Victor had seen, on the night he learned of William's death, a figure of gigantic stature moving through the darkness near the site of the murder. He knew with terrible certainty that his creation had killed William, but he could not speak this truth aloud without revealing his own guilty secret. Tormented by guilt and grief, Victor sought solace in the mountains, climbing to the highest peaks where the grandeur of nature might overwhelm his human sorrows. It was there, on the Mer de Glace, that he encountered the creature once more. The being approached him across the ice with superhuman speed and confronted its creator with a mixture of rage and desperate pleading. "Remember that I am thy creature," the monster said. "I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel, whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed. Everywhere I see bliss, from which I alone am irrevocably excluded. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. Make me happy, and I shall again be virtuous." The creature told Victor its story, of its awakening in Victor's apartment, alone and confused, of its first encounters with human beings, who fled screaming or attacked it on sight, of its months observing the cottagers and learning to speak and read, of its discovery of Victor's journal, which revealed the details of its creation and the disgust its creator had felt, of its growing understanding that it was utterly alone in the world, rejected by the very man who had given it life. "All men hate the wretched," the creature said. "How then must I be hated, who am miserable beyond all living things? Yet you, my Creator, detest and spurn me, thy creature to whom thou art bound by ties, only dissoluble by the annihilation of one of us." The creature made a demand. Victor must create a female companion for it, a being as hideous as itself, who would not recoil from its appearance, and who could provide the companionship and affection that all sentient beings require. In exchange, the creature promised to leave Europe forever, to take its mate to the wilds of South America, where they would live far from human civilization and trouble mankind no more. Victor was horrified by the request, but also moved by the creature's obvious suffering and loneliness. He recognized his own responsibility. He had created a being capable of thought and feeling, but had given it no means of finding happiness or satisfaction in the world. After much agonized deliberation, he agreed to the creature's demand, promising to create a female monster who could be its companion. Victor traveled to England and Scotland with Henry Clerval, ostensibly to learn new scientific techniques, but actually to find a remote location where he could perform his hideous work unobserved. He established a laboratory on a desolate island in the Orkneys and began the terrible task of assembling a female creature. But as the work progressed, doubts assailed him. What if the female refused to leave civilization with the male? What if they bred, creating a race of monsters that would threaten humanity? What if the female proved even more malignant than the male? In a moment of horror and revulsion, with the creature watching through the window of his laboratory, Victor tore apart the half-finished female, destroying months of work in a fit of moral panic. The creature's response was a howl of anguish and rage that would haunt Victor forever. You have destroyed the work which you began. What is it that you intend? Do you dare to break your promise? I will be with you on your wedding night." Victor interpreted this as a threat against his own life and determined to face the creature's vengeance with courage. But the creature had learned that the surest way to wound Victor was not through direct violence, but through destroying everything Victor loved. That very night, Henry Clerval was murdered, strangled in the same manner as William, left as a message and a warning of what was to come. Victor was arrested for the murder, released only when his father traveled to Scotland to vouch for him. Broken by guilt and grief, Victor returned to Geneva to fulfill his long-delayed promise to Mary Elizabeth. He was convinced that the creature would attack him on his wedding night, that the conflict between creator and creation would finally reach its bloody conclusion. He was armed and watchful, prepared to fight to the death. But once again, Victor had misunderstood the creature's intention. The attack came not against Victor himself, but against Elizabeth, who was strangled in her bridal chamber while Victor searched the house for his enemy. Victor heard her scream and rushed to her side, but he was too late. Elizabeth lay dead, her beautiful features frozen in an expression of terror, and through the window Victor caught a glimpse of the creature's hideous face, contorted in a grin of malevolent triumph. Victor's father, already weakened by the deaths of William and Justine, could not survive this final blow. He died a broken man, leaving Victor utterly alone in the world, the sole survivor of a family that had been systematically destroyed by the monster he had created. Victor's grief and guilt transformed into implacable hatred and determination. He swore vengeance, dedicated the remainder of his life to hunting down the creature and destroying it, no matter how long the pursuit might take or where it might lead. The chase led northward, ever northward, through Europe and into Russia. Across vast expanses of wilderness where the creature left traces for Victor to follow, as though it wanted to be pursued, as though it craved the continuation of this deadly game between creator and creation. The creature was stronger, faster, and more resilient than Victor, and it could survive conditions that would kill a normal man. But Victor was sustained by his hatred and his need for revenge, following even when his body screamed for rest, even when all reason said he should abandon the pursuit. Finally, the chase reached the Arctic, where both hunter and hunted traveled across the ice fields, each pursuing the other in an endless cycle of vengeance and despair. It was there that Walton's ship had become trapped, and there that Victor, near death, had been rescued by the sailors who saw his sled approaching across the ice. Victor told his tale to Walton as a warning, urging the captain to learn from his example and to avoid the dangers of unbridled ambition and the pursuit of knowledge without consideration of consequences. "Learn from me," Victor said, "if not by my precepts, at least by my example, how dangerous is the acquirement of knowledge, and how much happier that man is who believes his native town to be the world than he who aspires to become greater than his nature will allow." But even as Victor warned against ambition, he could not entirely renounce his own. Part of him still believed that his discoveries had been worth the cost, that the advancement of science justified any sacrifice. This contradiction between Victor's recognition of his guilt and his inability to fully repent was perhaps the most damning aspect of his character. He had learned nothing from his suffering except to regret, and even that regret was incomplete. Victor died on Walton's ship, his body finally succumbing to the hardships of his long pursuit. But before Walton could bury him, the creature appeared one final time, climbing through the cabin window to look upon the corpse of its creator. Walton, who had heard Victor's account of the monster's crimes, expected to find a being of pure malevolence, a devil incarnate. Instead, he found a creature overcome with grief and remorse, weeping over Victor's body and cursing itself for the suffering it had caused. "That is also my victim," the creature cried. "In his murder, my crimes are consummated. The miserable series of my being is wound to its close. O Frankenstein, generous and self-devoted being, what does it avail that I now ask thee to pardon me? I, who irretrievably destroyed thee by destroying all thou lovedst." The creature spoke of its own suffering, of the loneliness and rejection that had driven it to commit such terrible acts. It claimed that it had not been born evil, but had been made so by the cruelty of humanity and the abandonment of its Creator. Yet it also acknowledged that these explanations were not excuses, that it bore responsibility for its choices, that it had become the very monster that its appearance suggested. "Fear not that I shall be the instrument of future mischief," the creature told Walton. "My work is nearly complete. Neither yours nor any man's death is needed to consummate the series of my being and accomplish that which must be done. I shall quit your vessel on the ice raft which brought me thither, and shall seek the most northern extremity of the globe. I shall collect my funeral pile, and consume to ashes this miserable frame, that its remains may afford no light to any curious and unholy wretch who would create such another as I have been." With these words the creature departed, leaping from the cabin window onto the ice raft, and soon it was lost in the darkness and the distance. Walton never learned whether it truly destroyed itself, as it had promised, or whether it still wanders the frozen wastes, the last and only member of a species that should never have been created, a monument to the dangers of playing God. Walton, shaken by all he had witnessed and learned, abandoned his own ambitions of Arctic exploration. He ordered his ship to turn back as soon as the ice permitted, returning to England and to his sister, carrying with him the manuscript that contained Victor Frankenstein's confession and his own observations of these extraordinary events. He had learned the lesson that Victor had tried to teach, that some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue, that some ambitions lead only to destruction, and that the glory of discovery is worth nothing if it comes at the cost of one's humanity. The story of Victor Frankenstein and his creature has echoed through the centuries since these events, though most who hear it believe it to be mere fiction, and moral tale invented to frighten children or to illustrate the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition. But those who read Walton's letters, who examined the careful documentation of dates and places, who considered the internal consistency of Victor's account, must wonder, is it possible that this actually happened? Could some ambitious scientist have actually succeeded in creating life, only to abandon his creation in disgust and horror? The questions raised by Victor's tale go far beyond the mere possibility of reanimating dead tissue. They strike at the heart of what it means to be human, what responsibilities we bear for our creations, and what limits, if any, should be placed on scientific inquiry. Victor created a being capable of thought and feeling, gave it life and consciousness, but provided it with no means of finding acceptance or happiness in the world. Was the creature's subsequent violence an inevitable result of its hideous appearance? Or did Victor's abandonment and humanity's rejection transform a potentially benevolent being into a monster? The creature itself argued that it had been born innocent, that it had desired only companionship and acceptance, and that its crimes were the result of the intolerable suffering inflicted upon it by a world that judged it solely on its appearance, and a creator who abandoned it in its first moments of life. Yet the creature also demonstrated a capacity for vindictive cruelty that went beyond mere survival or self-defense. It killed not in rage or hunger, but deliberately, as revenge against Victor, targeting those Victor loved most, while leaving Victor himself alive to suffer. Victor, for his part, took no responsibility for the creature's development or for the suffering his creation endured. He fled from his creation in horror, never attempting to educate it or provide it with any means of survival or acceptance. He created life, but accepted no parental duty toward it, brought consciousness into being, but provided no moral guidance, and then was horrified when the being he had abandoned became the monster he had feared. Victor wanted the glory of creation without the responsibility of a creator, the triumph of playing God without the obligations that divine power entails. Perhaps the true horror of the story lies not in the physical ugliness of the creature or in the murders it committed, but in this failure of responsibility, in Victor's inability or unwillingness to accept the consequences of his actions. He created life and then abandoned it. He gave consciousness to a being and then refused to acknowledge any duty toward it. He wanted to be as God, but lacked the love and commitment that a true creator must possess. In the modern world, Victor's tale resonates with renewed urgency as we develop technologies that Victor could never have imagined. We manipulate genes, create artificial intelligence, develop weapons of unthinkable destructive power, and pursue knowledge in domains that previous generations would have considered the exclusive province of the divine. We stand now where Victor stood then, at the threshold of godlike power, and we must ask ourselves, have we learned the lessons his story was meant to teach? Do we consider the consequences of our creations before we bring them into being? Do we accept responsibility for what we make? Or do we, like Victor, create and then abandon, innovate, and then disclaim liability for the results? Do we recognize that some knowledge might be too dangerous to pursue? Or do we insist that all inquiry is justified by the abstract principle of scientific freedom? The creature Victor created wanted only what all conscious beings want: acceptance, companionship, purpose, and love. It was denied all of these things through no fault of its own, judged and rejected based on its appearance rather than its actions or character. In its desperation and suffering, it became the monster that humanity's rejection had made inevitable. This transformation from innocent to evil, from benevolent to malevolent, was not predestined, but resulted from the failure of both creator and society to provide what every conscious being requires. There is a terrible warning here about how we treat those who are different, those who do not fit our expectations or aesthetic preferences, those whose appearance or origin marks them as other. The creature was not born evil. It became evil through abandonment and rejection. How many human tragedies follow this same pattern? How many monsters do we create through our own failures of compassion and imagination? As night falls over the Arctic waste, as the ice groans and shifts beneath the eternal stars, we imagine the creature making its way to the northernmost reaches of the world, building its funeral pyre and consigning itself to the flames. Perhaps it found the peace in death that life had denied it. Perhaps it finally escaped the suffering that had driven it to such terrible acts. Or perhaps it could not go through with its promised self-destruction, could not surrender the spark of life that Victor had given it, and still wanders the frozen darkness, alone and eternal, a warning and a tragedy, the last survivor of an experiment that should never have been attempted. Victor lies buried somewhere in the Arctic ice, his body preserved by the cold, his dreams of scientific glory transformed into a nightmare from which he never awoke. He sought to conquer death and create life, to be remembered as the benefactor of humanity, to achieve immortal fame through his discoveries. Instead, he destroyed everyone he loved and died in pursuit of the creature he had abandoned, achieving only the immortality of infamy, remembered not as a hero but as a warning about the dangers of ambition divorced from wisdom and responsibility. Captain Walton returned to England and to his ordinary life, his dreams of Arctic exploration abandoned, his ambition tempered by the terrible lessons he had learned. He never forgot Victor Frankenstein or the creature, never stopped wondering whether he had done the right thing in recording their story for posterity. Should such knowledge be preserved or suppressed? Should the world learn from Victor's mistakes, or would the publication of his methods simply enable other ambitious scientists to repeat them? These questions remain unanswered, hanging in the Arctic air like the aurora borealis, beautiful, mysterious, and forever beyond our grasp. The story of Frankenstein and his creature has no tidy resolution, no clear moral that can be extracted and applied to other situations. It is a tragedy in the classical sense, a tale of fundamentally decent people whose flaws and choices lead inexorably to destruction, a narrative that inspires not only horror but also pity for both victim and victimizer. In the end, we are left with the image of two beings, creator and creation, father and son in a twisted sense, locked in their deadly embrace. Their fates intertwined from the moment Victor first applied the electrical spark to assembled flesh and brought consciousness into being where none had existed before. They were bound together by ties that neither could break, each condemned by the actions of the other, each the source of the other's greatest suffering. Victor created the creature and gave it life, but he also condemned it to a life of loneliness and rejection. The creature murdered Victor's loved ones and drove him to madness and death, but it also suffered torments that Victor never fully acknowledged or understood. Neither was entirely victim nor entirely villain. Both were caught in a tragedy of their own making, unable to break free from the cycle of violence and revenge that Victor's ambition had set in motion. The monster wanted only to be loved. Victor wanted only to be great. Neither achieved their desire, and both paid a terrible price for their failures. In this, perhaps, lies the deepest warning of the tale, that our wants and our ambitions, pursued without wisdom or restraint, without consideration of consequences or responsibility for our creations, can destroy not only ourselves, but all those around us, leaving only regret and ashes where there might have been love and life. The ice closes over the place where Victor died, and the Arctic night settles once more into its eternal darkness. Somewhere in that waste, a creature that should not exist may still wander, or may have fulfilled its promise and consigned itself to flames. We will never know. But the story remains, passed down through the generations, a warning written in blood and ice, a meditation on responsibility and consequences, on the dangers of playing God without possessing divine wisdom or compassion. The laboratory in Ingolstadt is long gone, its horrors dispersed into forgotten corners of the world. The Frankenstein family is extinct, their line ended in tragedy and horror. But the questions raised by Victor's actions remain as urgent and unanswerable as ever. What do we owe to our creations? Where should we place the limits of scientific inquiry? How do we balance the pursuit of knowledge with the requirements of wisdom and responsibility? These are the questions that haunt us still, in an age when we have power that Victor never dreamed of, when we stand at the threshold of creating life in ways he could never have imagined. The creature's final words echo across the centuries, a warning and a plea. I shall be with you on your wedding night. The night may be metaphorical now, the moment when we unleash consequences we cannot control, when our creations turn against us, when we reap the whirlwind of our own ambition. But the warning remains valid, perhaps more so now than when Mary Shelley first penned this tale of horror and responsibility. The fire burns low, and the shadows lengthen, and we are left to contemplate the eternal questions raised by this story of a man who sought to be as God and a creature who wanted only to be human. Neither achieved their goal, and both were destroyed in the attempt. Let their fate stand as warning to all who would follow in Victor's footsteps, who would pursue knowledge without wisdom, who would create without accepting the responsibilities that creation entails. The Arctic wind howls across the ice, carrying with it perhaps the last cries of a creature that never should have existed, the eternal regret of a creator who abandoned his creation, and the warning that echoes through the ages. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Some knowledge, once gained, can never be forgotten. And some monsters are made not born, created by our own failures of compassion, wisdom, and love. Thus ends the tale of Frankenstein and his creature, a story as old as human ambition and as current as tomorrow's headlines, a warning carved in ice and written in blood, reminding us always that with great power comes great responsibility, and that the price of playing God is paid not only by the one who dares to usurp divine prerogatives, but by all the innocent souls who suffer the consequences of that terrible ambition.